The year 1873 smelled of pine sap and gunpowder for Grace Miller. It also smelled of wood smoke, cheap whiskey, and the ever-present damp that clung to the hem of her dress. She knew the world through the soles of her worn boots, the texture of rough-hewn lumber beneath her fingertips, and the symphony of sounds that told her everything she needed to know. The sharp, rhythmic bite of an axe into a cedar told her the men were working the North Ridge. The low grumble of Thomas Crane's voice meant he was tallying his profits, and the jingle of his pocket watch chain was a sound that always made the small hairs on her arms stand up. The logging camp at Hell Creek was a wound carved into the Oregon borderlands, a place of mud, sweat, and groaning timber. Men with hard hands and empty eyes felled giants that had stood since before their grandfathers were born. They worked from can't see to can't see, fueled by salted pork and the promise of a payday that was always another week away. And in the center of this grim world was Grace, the blind girl, Thomas Crane's most peculiar possession. He had purchased her in a dusty California town from a man who claimed she could smell water and predict the weather. Crane, a man whose greed was a far more powerful force than his reason, believed in luck the way other men believed in God. He saw Grace not as a person, but as a talisman, a piece of living magic. He called her his lucky Grace, and as long as his timber yields were high and his card games profitable, he treated her with a kind of detached care, like a man polishing a prized rifle. But when fortune soured, his temper, like a cornered animal, would lash out at the nearest, safest target. Grace spent her days in the cookhouse, a smoky shack that was the heart of the camp. She kneaded dough for bread, her fingers knowing the feel of a perfectly risen loaf. She peeled potatoes with a small knife, her thumbs gauging the thickness of the skin with a precision that amazed the other camp workers. They left her alone, mostly. They saw the way Crane watched her, his possessive gaze a fence around her. She was his, and what was his, no other man touched. Her world, though dark, was richly detailed. She could tell who was approaching by the weight of their footfalls. She knew the mood of the camp by the pitch and cadence of the men's voices as they came in from the forest. She felt the sun on her face and knew the time of day, felt the shift in the breeze and knew a storm was coming long before the sky turned gray. Her blindness had not taken her sight. It had simply moved it to her skin, her ears, her nose. It was a world of profound sensation, one that the seeing men around her could never comprehend. Miles away, hidden in the labyrinthine lava beds and dense pine forests, another man was navigating a world of his own. His name was Red Cloud, and he was a ghost. He was one of the few Modoc warriors who had escaped the slaughter at Tule Lake, a name that was now a scar on the land and on his soul. The soldiers had come with their big guns and their blue coats, talking of peace while planning for war. He had seen his people, his family, cut down. He had fought back with a fury born of desperation, and now he was hunted. His senses were as sharp as Grace's, but tuned to different frequencies. He heard the snap of a twig half a mile away, and knew if it was deer or man. He smelled the cold scent of iron from a rifle barrel, and knew the army patrols were near. He moved through the wilderness not as a trespasser, but as a part of it, his buckskin clothes the color of dry earth, his steps silent as falling snow. He was a warrior without a tribe, a man whose heart was a cold, hard stone of grief and rage. Vengeance was a fire in his belly, but survival was the air he breathed, and survival had led him here, to the edges of this noisy, foul-smelling logging camp, a place that reeked of the white man's world he so despised. He had been watching it for 3 days, a shadow among the trees, learning its rhythms, its weaknesses. That evening, the air grew thick and heavy. A late autumn chill crept down from the mountains, and the men huddled closer to the fire in the main clearing, their laughter coarse and loud. Inside the cookhouse, the air was warm, smelling of baking bread and simmering stew. Grace was cleaning up, her hands moving with familiar grace over the wooden countertop. The camp had one good lantern, an expensive brass model Crane had won in a poker game. It was her job to clean the globe and fill the reservoir. She worked carefully, her fingers tracing the cool, smooth curve of the glass. She had just finished polishing it when Crane stormed in. He was in a foul mood. She had heard it in his steps, heavy and angry, striking the earth with punishing force. One of his wagons had broken an axle, losing a half-day's haul. "Is that lantern ready?" he snapped, his voice cutting through the quiet hum of the kitchen. "Almost, Mr. Crane," Grace said softly, her hands moving a little faster. "Just need to trim the wick." "Hurry it up. The dark brings bad luck." He paced behind her, the jingle of his watch chain a frantic, nervous sound. She reached for the small scissors she kept on the shelf. Her fingers brushed against a tin cup, knocking it off balance. It clattered to the floor, a loud, jarring sound in the small space. Startled, her elbow bumped the lantern. For a moment, it seemed to hang in the air, a suspended orb of brass and glass. Then it fell. The crash was sickeningly final. The glass globe shattered, and the smell of spilled kerosene filled the room. Silence, a terrible, suffocating silence. Grace stood frozen, her hands outstretched as if she could somehow gather the broken pieces from the air. She could feel Crane's rage building behind her, a physical heat that prickled her skin. "You clumsy fool," he seethed, each word a drop of venom. "That was my luck. You broke my luck." She flinched as he stepped towards her. She could smell the whiskey on his breath now, sharp and sour. She knew what was coming. She had felt the back of his hand before, the sting that blossomed into a dull, throbbing ache. But tonight was different. The exhaustion of her life, the unending darkness, the weight of his superstition, it all felt like a stone pressing down on her chest, squeezing the air from her lungs. He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh like claws. "You are going to pay for this." He raised his other hand. She could feel the air shift as his arm swung back. She turned her face away, her body tensing for the impact, a small, desperate sound escaping her lips. "Don't hit me," she begged, her voice a thin, raw whisper that was nearly swallowed by the roaring in her own ears. "I can't bear it anymore." A shadow fell across the doorway, so sudden and complete it was as if the night itself had just stepped inside. There was no sound of approach, no warning. One moment Crane's hand was descending, the next there was a solid, percussive thud. Crane cried out, a sharp yelp of pain and shock, and stumbled back, clutching his forearm. Standing in the doorway, a silhouette against the pale moonlight, was a man. He was tall and lean, holding a small axe. Not by the blade, but by the head. It was the smooth hickory handle of the axe that had blocked Crane's blow. Grace stood trembling, her head cocked, listening to the sudden chaos of two heartbeats where a moment ago there had been only her own terror. She heard Crane's ragged, pained breathing and the utter, profound stillness of the stranger. The man took a step into the room. The moonlight streamed in behind him, catching the sharp lines of his face and the dark intensity of his eyes. He said nothing. He did not need to. His presence filled the entire shack, an ancient and dangerous silence that smothered all other sound. Crane stared, his face a mask of fear and disbelief, at the Modoc warrior who had appeared from nowhere. The warrior's gaze was fixed on Crane, unwavering and cold as a river stone. The moonlight glinted off the dark, worn handle of the hatchet he held. And in that pale, ghostly light, against the backdrop of the deep and unforgiving wilderness, the Modoc warrior's hand trembled. The moment hung suspended, taut as a bowstring. Then the warrior moved. His motion was fluid and absolute, like water flowing downhill. He released the hatchet handle, and in the same movement, his hand closed around Grace's wrist. His grip was not cruel like Crane's had been. It was firm, definite, a statement of fact. He pulled her towards the door, out of the kerosene-scented air and into the vast, cold night. Behind them, Crane scrambled to his feet, cradling his bruised arm and shouting curses that were half rage, half fear. "After them. He's taking my luck. $100 to the man who brings him down and brings her back." The camp erupted. Men poured from the bunkhouse, grabbing rifles and lanterns. The night, which had been filled with the peaceful sounds of crickets and a low wind in the pines, was now a cacophony of shouting men and barking dogs. Grace stumbled, her bare feet struggling to find purchase on the rough, unfamiliar ground. The world had just been torn open, and she was falling through. One man's cruelty had been replaced by the terrifying unknown of another man's silence. His hand on her wrist was her only anchor. He did not slow down. He pulled her along, his strides long and certain, and she had no choice but to run, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. They plunged into the forest, leaving the lantern light and the shouting behind. The darkness was total, a thick velvet blanket that smothered everything, but for her rescuer, it seemed to be no obstacle. He navigated the treacherous terrain as if it were a sunlit meadow. He guided her around tree trunks she could feel the proximity of by the change in the air pressure on her skin. He pulled her up short before dips in the ground she would have tumbled into. He was her eyes, and his silence was a language she was forced to learn with every frantic step. The ground changed beneath her feet, from the soft pine needles of the forest floor to something sharp and brittle that crunched with every step. The air smelled different here, ancient and sterile, with a faint, sulphurous tang. It was the lava beds, a jagged, broken land of volcanic rock that could shred a man's boots and break an ankle. She could feel the sharp edges through the thin soles of her shoes. Her rescuer's pace did not slacken. He led her through narrow crevices, the rock walls so close she could feel their cold breath on her cheeks. Hours passed. The sounds of pursuit faded, lost in the confusing, sound-absorbing landscape. All Grace could hear was the rasp of her own breathing, the pounding of her blood in her ears, and the steady, rhythmic crunch of 2 pairs of feet on volcanic rock. Her lungs burned. A stitch flared in her side, but the hand on her wrist never loosened its grip. It was a relentless, irresistible force pulling her north. Finally, when she felt she could not take another step, he stopped. The silence that followed was immense. He released her wrist. She stood swaying, trying to catch her breath, every muscle in her body trembling with exhaustion. She heard the faint sound of leather creaking as he knelt, then the whisper of a canteen being opened. He pressed it into her hand. "Drink," he said. His voice was low and rough, like stones grinding together. It was the first word he had spoken. The water was cool and tasted of metal and earth. She drank greedily, the liquid a blessing on her parched throat. When she was done, she handed the canteen back into the darkness, and their fingers brushed. His skin was warm, calloused, and real. She sank to the ground, the sharp rocks pressing into her. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He was silent for a long moment. She heard him drink from the canteen before answering, "They call me Red Cloud." The name meant nothing to her, but it sounded like the wilderness itself, like wind and stone and solitude. "Why did you help me?" "I do not like to see a man raise his hand to a woman." The answer was simple, direct, yet it seemed to hold a world of meaning she could not yet grasp. She pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders, the night air biting at her skin. She had traded a familiar prison for a terrifying freedom. This man, this Red Cloud, had saved her from a beating. But what did he want from her? Where was he taking her? The fear she had lived with for years was a cunning thing. It did not vanish simply because her captor had changed. "You speak so little," she said, trying to fill the vast silence with something, anything. A blind person needs words, not silence. She heard a faint sound that might have been a humorless chuckle. "A warrior needs silence," he replied, his voice a low rumble in the dark. To hear the heart. His own or someone else's? She did not ask. She was too tired. She leaned her head back against a cold rock wall and, for the first time in a long time, she slept. Not the fitful, fearful sleep of the cookhouse, but a deep, bone-weary sleep of utter exhaustion. There in the heart of the wild, with a silent, dangerous stranger as her only guard. They were moving again before the first hint of dawn, which Grace could feel as a subtle shift in the air temperature and the first tentative notes of a songbird. The fog had rolled in, thick and wet, muffling sound and clinging to her clothes. It was a disorienting world, even for her. She relied on Red Cloud completely, her hand now resting on his arm as he led her through the mist-shrouded landscape of cedar and pine. She could smell the trees, a clean, sharp scent that was a relief after the stink of the logging camp. He moved with a quiet, predatory grace, his body a study in contained energy. She, on the other hand, felt clumsy and loud. Every snapped twig, every dislodged pebble seemed to echo in the fog. She was a liability, and she knew it. This knowledge chafed at her, a constant reminder of her helplessness. Red Cloud's instincts as a warrior were at war with the strange, protective impulse this woman had awakened in him. She was slow. She was noisy. Traveling with her was a risk. Every rational part of his mind, the part that had kept him alive while his brothers fell, told him to leave her, find a town, leave her on the steps of a church, and disappear back into the mountains where he belonged. But he could not. The memory of her plea, so full of despair, was a hook in his conscience. And when he looked at her, seeing the way she navigated her sightless world with a courage he had rarely witnessed, something in his hardened heart shifted. It was a dangerous feeling, this flicker of compassion. Compassion was a luxury a hunted man could not afford. Late in the afternoon, they stopped to rest in a small clearing. Red Cloud had speared a fish from a fast-moving creek with a sharpened stick, and he cooked it over a small, smokeless fire he built with an expertise that was like magic to her. The smell of the roasting fish made her stomach ache with hunger. As she ate the flaky, delicious meat with her fingers, she thought of Thomas Crane. She could picture him, his face purple with rage, organizing the pursuit. He would not give up. She was his property, his lucky charm. His pride would not let her go. She shivered, though the fire was warm. "They are still coming for us, aren't they?" she asked quietly. Red Cloud did not answer immediately. He was listening, his head tilted slightly, his focus on the world beyond their small clearing. "Yes," he said at last. "They are 2 hours behind, maybe 3. Grace's blood ran cold. "How can you know that?" "I can hear their horses," he said simply, "and their anger." She tried to listen, to stretch her senses as he did, but she heard nothing but the crackle of the fire and the whisper of the wind. She was blind in more ways than one. Here, in this world, he was the one who could see, and she was the one who stumbled in the dark. The realization was humbling and frightening. Her life was utterly in his hands, and she still did not know if those hands, the same hands that had trembled after saving her, were the hands of a savior or just a different kind of cage. The north was still a long, dark road away. The pursuit had pushed them high into the rocky spine of the mountains. Red Cloud drove them onward, not with words, but with an unrelenting pressure on her arm, guiding her up slopes of loose scree where she had to feel for every footstep. The air grew thinner, colder. She could feel the vast, open emptiness around her, a terrifying sensation for someone who relied on walls and trees to define her world. Just as her strength was about to fail her entirely, he pulled her to a sudden halt. The air in front of her face changed. It was still and carried a cool, mineral scent, like a deep cellar. He guided her forward through a narrow opening, the rocks scraping against her shawl. Then the space opened up, and the sound of their footsteps changed, echoing in a way she had never heard before. A single drop of water fell from a great height, and the sound of its impact was a tiny, perfect bell that rang and rang in the profound quiet. "Where are we?" she whispered, and her own voice came back to her from the darkness, a ghostly twin. "A safe place," Red Cloud answered, his voice lower than usual, absorbed by the stone. The mountain has a hollow heart. He led her deeper inside. The floor was surprisingly smooth, worn down by centuries of water that no longer flowed. He sat her down and she heard him moving about. The soft scrape of his moccasins, the only sound. Soon, the scent of wood smoke, so faint it was barely there, reached her, and a gentle warmth began to push back the subterranean chill. They ate in silence. Jerky and a handful of dried berries he produced from a pouch. The food was tough but nourishing. For the first time since their flight began, Grace felt a fragile sense of security. The mountain was wrapped around them, a solid, impenetrable shield. "This cave," she said into the darkness, "it talks." She felt him turn towards her. "The stones are always talking. You must only learn how to listen." He took her hand and placed it flat against the cave wall. It was cold, damp, and alive with a faint, almost imperceptible vibration. It felt like placing a hand on the chest of a sleeping giant. "Close your eyes," he said, and she smiled faintly. "They are always closed," she reminded him gently. "No," he said, his voice serious. "You look with your mind. Let that go. Just feel the age. The mountain remembers the fire that made it. It remembers the ice that carved it. It remembers everything that has ever touched it. Listen with your skin." She did as he asked, clearing her mind of everything but the sensation beneath her palm. She focused on the cold, the texture, the deep, resonant thrum of the earth's core. And slowly, something shifted. The rock was no longer just a dead thing. It had a presence, a story. She could almost feel the weight of the ages pressing against her hand. A story told not in words, but in immense, slow pressure. Days blurred into a strange, timeless rhythm in the belly of the mountain. He would leave for hours at a time, silent as a ghost, and return with water or food. In the cave, he continued his strange lessons. He taught her how to tell the difference between the scent of coming rain on dry earth and the scent of snow on the wind. He taught her to identify birds by the cadence of their songs, which echoed faintly from the world outside. He was unspooling the world for her, translating it from a language of sight into a language of pure sensation that she already understood, but had never had a teacher to guide her. One afternoon, a sliver of impossible brightness appeared in their dark world. A single, needle-thin shaft of sunlight had found its way through a crack in the ceiling, striking a patch of the far wall. Grace knew something was different because the quality of the air changed, and Red Cloud fell silent. "What is it?" she asked. "The sun has found us," he said. He led her across the cavern, his hand on her elbow. He stopped her a few feet from the wall and took her hand, guiding it forward into the open air. Her fingers met a patch of warmth that was unlike the fire. It was a clean, penetrating heat, a living thing. It danced on her skin, vibrant and weightless. She could feel the particles of dust motes, tiny explosions of energy against her fingertips. It was the first time in her life she had ever truly felt light. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and sudden. "It is so beautiful," she breathed. Though she had no word or image for what beauty was, she only knew the feeling, this radiant warmth that seemed to fill the emptiness inside her. He said nothing, but she could feel his stillness beside her, feel the weight of his gaze. They stood there for a long time, sharing the small miracle, until the sun moved on and the light was gone, leaving only the memory of its warmth on her hand. That evening, the intimacy of the moment lingered in the air between them. The barrier of his silence seemed thinner, more fragile. "You hate them, don't you?" she said, her voice soft. "The men like Crane, the soldiers." She heard him shift, the rustle of his buckskin shirt. "Hate is a fire that cooks the man who holds it." "But you hold it," she insisted gently. "I can feel it. It is cold, not hot. Why did you not kill him, Crane? I mean, you could have—" The silence stretched. The only sound was the slow drip, drip of water. each drop an echo of the one before. She thought he would not answer, but then he began to speak, his voice a low monotone, as if reciting a story he had told himself 1,000 times in the dark. When I was a boy, the soldiers came to our village on the lake. They brought paper with words on it and spoke of peace. My mother did not trust their words. She said a man's heart is in his eyes, not on paper. Their eyes were hungry. He paused, and Grace could picture it. A small boy watching men in blue coats, not understanding their language, but understanding their intent. They wanted the land. They always want the land. There was a fight, not a battle. A battle is between warriors. This was a slaughter. I was hidden in the reeds with the other children. I watched them. I watched a soldier, a boy no older than I am now, with yellow hair and fear in his eyes, point his rifle at my mother. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion, yet the pain was a living thing in the small, warm space of the cave. She was holding a basket of berries. She looked at him, and she was not afraid. She held the basket out to him. As an offering, he shot her. The berries fell and stained the ground red, like blood. I have hated the color of his hair, the color of his coat, the sound of his language ever since. Grace felt a profound sorrow settle over her. It was not pity. It was a shared understanding of loss, a recognition of a wound so deep it becomes part of who you are. But, Red Cloud continued, his voice changing, a flicker of something else entering it. As she fell, she looked at me. I saw her. She did not want me to see hate. She wanted me to live. A warrior kills to protect his people. He does not kill to quiet the ghosts in his own heart. Killing Crane would not bring her back. It would only have made another ghost. Now she understood. She understood the trembling hand, the warrior's restraint, the deep well of sadness she had sensed in him from the beginning. He was not just a survivor. He was a man holding on to his mother's last wish, a man fighting a war not only against the soldiers, but against the hatred in his own soul. Without thinking, she reached out in the darkness until her hand found his arm. His muscles were hard as stone beneath her touch. She said nothing. There were no words for this kind of pain. There was only the simple, human connection of touch, a silent acknowledgement that he was not alone with his ghosts in that cave. He did not pull away. For a long moment, they sat like that, two solitary souls in the heart of the mountain, while the echoes of the past whispered all around them. Their sanctuary in the mountain could not last forever. Red Cloud knew this. The restlessness of the hunted was a permanent condition, a current that always pulled him toward the horizon. After several days, he decided they had to move on. The air outside the cave had the crisp, clean feel of true autumn, a warning of the lean months to come. He led her out of the deep, echoing dark and back into a world of wind and sky. For Grace, emerging from the cave was like being born a second time. The world felt wider, the sounds sharper. She could distinguish the whisper of wind through pine needles from its different rustle in the aspen leaves. The sun on her face was no longer just a vague warmth, but a presence, a direction, a thing she had touched with her own hands. Her trust in Red Cloud was no longer a desperate, fearful thing. It had taken root in the darkness of the cave, nurtured by his unexpected gentleness and the shared vulnerability of his story. She followed him not just because she had to, but because she wanted to. They traveled for 2 days, moving north through a series of rugged, tree-choked canyons. Red Cloud was even more silent than before. His senses stretched taut. He was a tightly coiled spring, and Grace could feel the tension in the arm she held. She knew they were being followed. She did not need him to tell her. She could hear it in the unnatural silence of the birds, in the way Red Cloud would freeze, his head cocked, listening to vibrations in the earth she could not detect. The discovery came abruptly. They were making their way along a narrow ledge overlooking a steep, rock-strewn gorge when Red Cloud stopped so suddenly she collided with his back. He pushed her down behind a cluster of boulders, his hand a firm weight on her shoulder. "Soldiers," he breathed, the word a puff of cold air against her ear. "And Crane." Grace's heart seized. She could hear them now. The jingle of harnesses, the clink of metal on rock, the low murmur of men's voices floating up from the canyon floor below. They had found their trail. Crane, robbed of his prize, must have gone to the nearest fort and spun a tale of a savage Modoc and a helpless, kidnapped girl. Red Cloud's mind was racing. The ledge offered no escape forward or back. Their only chance was down, into the gorge, to try and lose them in the maze of rocks and shadows. But the descent would be slow and treacherous, especially for Grace. "Listen to me," he whispered, his voice urgent. "I'm going to make them follow me. When they are past, you will hide. Do not move. Do not make a sound until the sun has set twice." Before she could protest, he was gone. She heard the scrape of his moccasins on rock, then a loud clatter as he deliberately sent a cascade of small stones tumbling down the cliff face 100 yards to their left. Shouts erupted from below. The soldiers had taken the bait. She heard the sounds of their pursuit moving away, following the false trail. Grace stayed curled behind the rocks, her body rigid with fear. She prayed to a God she was not sure she believed in, prayed for the safety of the silent man who had shown her more kindness than any other. The sounds of the chase grew fainter, a chaotic blend of shouts and the occasional crack of a rifle shot that echoed ominously through the canyon. She did not know how long she waited. Time had dissolved into a state of pure terror. Then she heard a new sound, the crunch of a boot on the gravel of the ledge. Not the light, silent step of Red Cloud, but the heavy, deliberate tread of a soldier. She held her breath, trying to will herself into the stone. Found her, a voice called out, triumphant and close. Hands grabbed her, pulling her roughly to her feet. She cried out, struggling, but she was surrounded. The air was thick with the scent of wool uniforms, sweat, and leather. "Well, well, look what we have here," a familiar voice sneered. Thomas Crane pushed his way through the soldiers. "My lucky charm. You have caused me a great deal of trouble, girl." A different voice cut through Crane's gloating. "That's enough. Mr. Crane, she's in the custody of the United States Army now." The voice was young, clear, and carried an authority that made Crane fall silent. Grace felt a presence before her, calmer than the others. "Are you hurt?" Miss, the young voice asked. "No," she whispered, trembling. "My name is Lieutenant Reed. We were told you were taken against your will." Before she could answer, a shout came from further down the ledge. "Lieutenant! Over here!" Lieutenant Reed moved away, and Grace was left standing between two soldiers. Her world a confusing storm of sounds and smells. She heard Reed's voice, distant now, giving orders. There was a period of tense waiting. Crane paced nearby, muttering to himself. Then the lieutenant returned. His steps were slower now, more somber. "We found him," he said, his voice quiet. Grace's heart stopped. It seems he lost his footing. He fell into the gorge. No one could have survived it. In that moment, something inside Grace Miller broke, and something new and hard was forged in its place. The terror for Red Cloud was a physical thing, a cold sickness in her stomach. But beneath it, a different instinct flared to life, fierce and protective. She knew, with a certainty that defied all logic, that Lieutenant Reed was wrong. Red Cloud would not have been so careless. It was a trick, a desperate gamble to save them both. And now, it was her turn to play her part. She let out a sob, a ragged, convincing sound of grief and shock. She allowed her knees to buckle, and the soldiers holding her had to tighten their grip to keep her upright. "He saved me," she choked out, letting the real tears of fear for him be mistaken for tears of loss. "That man, Mr. Crane, he was going to hurt me. The other one, the Indian, he pulled me away. We ran. He was just trying to get me away." She felt the lieutenant's attention focus on her entirely. She could feel his quiet, assessing gaze. "The Modoc," Reed said, his voice gentle but firm. "He is the one who fell." "Yes," Grace whispered. She built the lie from the truth of her own blindness, from the chaos of the last few hours. It all happened so fast. There was shouting, guns. He told me to hide. Then I heard him cry out, and a terrible sound. A long fall. I heard the rocks. And then... nothing. She took a shuddering breath. He is gone. She had never told such a complete and deliberate lie in her entire life. The words felt strange and foreign in her mouth, but she pushed them out, shaping them with the conviction of a seasoned actor. She was protecting him. The thought was a shield against the shame of the falsehood. For the first time, she was not a passive victim of circumstance. She was a participant. She was a fighter. There was a long silence. She could hear the wind whistling through the gorge. A mournful sound. She felt the weight of Lieutenant Reed's skepticism. He was a smart man. She had sensed that in his voice. He would not be easily fooled. "I see," he said finally, his tone unreadable. He turned his attention to Crane. "Mr. Crane, according to this young woman, you were the aggressor. That puts a different light on things."
"That is a lie,"
Crane blustered.
"She is my property. That savage bewitched her."
"She is not property, sir. She is a person," Reed said, his voice as cold and sharp as a shard of ice. "And she is now under my protection. We will take her back to Fort Klamath. Her testimony will be required." He had believed her, or at least he had chosen to. Grace felt a wave of dizzying relief, so potent it almost buckled her knees again. The soldiers led her away. She did not know where Red Cloud was, whether he was hurt or even if he was still alive. She only knew that she had bought him time. She had thrown a lie into the path of his pursuers, a shield made of nothing but words and her own desperate hope. Far above them, hidden in a crevice so narrow it was little more than a scar in the rock, Red Cloud watched them go. His shoulder was on fire. A soldier's bullet had torn through the muscle, a white-hot line of agony. He pressed a handful of moss against the wound to staunch the bleeding, his face pale and beaded with sweat. He had seen Grace's capture, had heard her cry out. He had been about to show himself, to draw their fire and give her a chance to escape, a final, suicidal act of protection. But then he had heard her voice, clear and steady, weaving her story. He had watched in disbelief as the young lieutenant listened, his sharp eyes scanning the gorge. He saw the moment the officer made his decision, turning his back on the cliff and leading his men, and the girl, away. She had saved him, the blind girl, who stumbled on flat ground and was afraid of the open sky, had stood before a patrol of armed soldiers and turned them aside with nothing but her wits. A fierce, painful pride swelled in his chest, warring with the agony in his shoulder. She was not weak. She was a survivor, just like him. He watched until her small, retreating figure disappeared from view, a captive being led back to the world he had tried to save her from. Now, he was the one who was trapped, wounded, and alone, with nothing but the vast, indifferent wilderness for a companion and the image of her courage as his only warmth. Lieutenant Reed led her and his men for a mile back along the trail before he called the halt. He dismissed the other soldiers, sending them to make a cold camp a short distance away, out of earshot. He turned to Grace, and in the quiet that followed, she could feel his steady, thoughtful presence. He gave her a canteen and a piece of hardtack. "Tell me again." "Miss," he said, his voice low and serious, "tell me everything. From the beginning. Not the story for my men, or for Mr. Crane. The truth." And so she did. She spoke of her life at the camp, of Crane's cruelty cloaked in superstitious affection. She described the broken lantern and the terror she had felt when he raised his hand. She told him how the silent warrior had appeared like an apparition, how he had led her into the wilderness not as a captor, but as a guide, sharing his water and his food, teaching her about the world she could not see. She spoke of the cave, and of his story about his mother. Her voice did not tremble. The lie she had told to protect Red Cloud had given her a strange new strength. And the truth, spoken now to this one man who seemed willing to listen, solidified it. When she finished, the silence was profound. Lieutenant Reed did not move for a long time. Grace could hear the soft creak of his leather holster as he breathed. He was weighing her words against his duty, against the reports he had heard, against the angry, blustering claims of Thomas Crane. "The law is a clumsy thing out here." "Miss Miller?" he said at last, his voice heavy with a weariness that seemed too old for a young man. "If I take you to the fort, you will be questioned. Crane will tell his story, and you will tell yours. You are a blind girl, and he is a man of some property. I do not know which way the scales of justice would tip, and the Modoc, if he is alive, he is still a wanted man." He took a step closer. "I am going to ride ahead and scout the trail. I will be gone for some time. This is a difficult and confusing country. It is easy for a person to get lost. It is easy for a patrol to lose track of someone they are supposed to be protecting." Grace's breath caught in her throat. She understood his meaning perfectly. It was a gift, a risk, a quiet act of defiance against the very uniform he wore. "Thank you," she whispered, the words inadequate for the magnitude of what he was offering. "Find a safe place. Miss," he said, his voice barely audible. "The world is not kind to people who are different. Find a place where you can be safe." Then he was gone. She heard the sound of his horse walking away, the footfalls fading into the vast wilderness. She waited, counting to 500, before she moved. She turned her back on the direction of the soldiers' camp and began to walk, plunging back into the wild, guided by the memory of Red Cloud's hand on her arm. She did not know where she was going. She only knew she had to try to find him. She used the lessons he had taught her, feeling the slope of the land through the soles of her boots, keeping the faint afternoon sun on her right cheek to ensure she was heading roughly west, back towards the gorge. She listened. She listened for the snap of a twig, the call of a bird, anything that sounded out of place. Her world was a tapestry of sound and sensation, and she searched it desperately for a single, broken thread. Night fell, and she had to stop. She found a hollow at the base of a pine tree, its deep roots forming a shallow shelter. She huddled there, cold and terrified, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the nocturnal forest. She thought of Red Cloud, wounded and alone. The fear she felt for him was a sharp, physical ache, a pain worse than any hunger or cold. She had to find him. The next day she pushed on, her search growing more desperate. Her hope was a guttering candle flame. How could a blind girl possibly find one man in this immense, rugged landscape? It was impossible. She was about to give up, to sink to the ground and weep in despair, when she heard it. It was a single, harsh cry from high above, a raven, but there was something wrong with the sound. It was too rhythmic, too deliberate. A call, then a pause, then the same call again. It was a signal, a flicker of intuition, a feeling more than a thought, told her it was him. He was alive, and he was trying to guide her. She moved towards the sound, scrambling over rocks and through thick underbrush. The calls grew weaker, and she feared she had lost them. But then another sound reached her, much closer, a soft moan of pain, quickly stifled. It came from a narrow fissure in a rock face, almost completely hidden by overgrown juniper bushes. "Red Cloud," she whispered, her voice trembling. A weak response came from the darkness within. "Grace." She pushed her way through the bushes and into the crevice. It was a shallow cave, barely large enough for a man to lie down. The air inside was thick with the coppery smell of blood. She knelt, her hands finding his form. He was lying on his side, his body radiating a dangerous heat. Her fingers brushed his shoulder, and he hissed in pain. It was wet and sticky. "You are hurt," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "A scratch," he lied, his voice strained. The fever was in his words, a slight, slurring rasp. She knew he was lying. She tore a long strip from the hem of her petticoat, her fingers working quickly. She found the canteen at his side and soaked the cloth in the cool water. Gently, she began to clean the wound. It was a ragged, ugly thing, the cloth coming away dark with blood. He flinched under her touch but did not pull away. She worked in silence, her movements deft and focused. She cleaned the wound as best she could and then bound it tightly with another strip of cloth. She felt his forehead. It was burning. The fever was rising, and they had no medicine, no food, nothing but a little water and the shelter of this small cave. For 2 days, he drifted in and out of consciousness. Grace did not leave his side. She kept the wound clean and gave him sips of water. When he shivered with chills, she lay beside him, trying to share the warmth of her own body. When the fever raged, she bathed his face with cool water. In his delirium, he spoke in the Modoc tongue, his words sharp and angry, then soft and pleading. She did not understand the language, but she understood the pain. She heard the name of his mother repeated like a prayer. On the second night, the fever was at its worst. His breathing was shallow and ragged. She was afraid he was going to die, desperate to offer some comfort, to pull him back from the edge. She began to sing. It was a lullaby her own mother had sung to her when she was a small child. A simple, sweet melody about a river flowing home to the sea. Her voice was soft and unsteady at first, but it grew stronger as the familiar words filled the small, dark space. She sang the song over and over, her voice a thin thread of hope in the deep night. As she sang, she felt a change in him. The tension in his body seemed to ease. His breathing deepened, becoming more regular. She finished the song, and in the silence that followed, she heard a sound that made her own heart ache. It was the sound of a man weeping, quiet, broken sobs that were torn from the deepest part of his soul. Instinctively, she reached out and touched his face to soothe him. Her fingers traced the line of his jaw, and she felt the wetness of tears on his cheek. He turned his face into her hand, and his sobs subsided into a long, shuddering sigh. She did not pull her hand away. In that moment, with the sound of his grief still echoing in the darkness, she felt an overwhelming urge to know him, to see him in the only way she could. Her fingers, light as a moth's wing, began to explore the landscape of his face. She traced the high, sharp line of his cheekbones, the strong bridge of his nose. She felt the surprising softness of his eyelashes, the firm set of his mouth. Her thumb brushed across a thin, raised scar above his eyebrow, a story written in his skin. His face was a map of his life, a testament to his strength and his sorrow. "Now I know what you look like," she whispered, her voice full of a wonder that was almost reverence. Strong, but sad. He did not speak. He simply lay there, his face cradled in her palm. She could feel the steady beat of his pulse beneath her fingertips. She had touched him as a healer, as a comforter, but this was different. This was a touch of discovery, of profound and unsettling intimacy. She felt his hand come up and cover hers, his fingers lacing through her own. His hand was warm, calloused, the hand of a warrior, a hunter, a survivor. It was the hand that had blocked Crane's blow, the hand that had pulled her from the logging camp, the hand that had guided her through the wilderness. And as his hand held hers against his tear-stained cheek, under a sky she could not see but knew was turning the color of blood and fire with the coming dawn, she felt it, a fine, unmistakable tremor that ran through his fingers. The warrior's hand trembled, not with weakness, not with anger, but with the terrifying, beautiful, and utterly overwhelming force of a heart learning how to feel again. The dawn that followed the breaking of the fever was cold and clear. Red Cloud was weak, the fire in his body replaced by a deep, aching exhaustion. But his mind was sharp once more. The agony in his shoulder was a constant, grinding presence. He knew the wound was not healing properly. It was deep, and the fever was a sign that a poison was working its way through his blood. "We cannot stay here," he said, his voice a hoarse rasp. He tried to push himself up and fell back with a gasp of pain. His face beaded with sweat. "You cannot travel," Grace stated, her voice firm. The fear of the previous night replaced by a resolve she had not known she possessed. "You will tear the wound open again." "There is a place," he said, breathing heavily. "A woman. She lives where the mountain breathes smoke. She knows the old ways of healing." He paused, the effort of speaking costing him. "It is a day's walk. North. I cannot make it alone." The admission of weakness was a thing of immense weight. It was a confession, an act of trust more profound than any words of affection. He was placing his life, which he had guarded so fiercely and for so long, into her hands. "Then you will not be alone," Grace said simply. "Tell me how to find the way." The journey was an agonizing crawl. Grace became his crutch, his guide, his will. She looped his good arm over her shoulders, taking on much of his weight. He was heavy, a dead weight of fever-spent muscle and bone, and her own small frame screamed in protest. But she did not falter. He would describe the path in short, breathless sentences, and she would translate his words into a map she could feel with her feet. "Follow the creek bed until the stones turn black and sharp. The wind comes from a gap in the ridge to the west. Keep it on your left cheek." She used all the skills he had taught her senses straining to read the world around them. She could feel the subtle changes in the terrain, smell the stands of different trees, hear the echoes that told her a rock wall was near. It was she who found the water, a tiny, hidden spring bubbling from a mat of moss. It was she who found a small patch of late-season berries to give them strength. He leaned on her. His breathing labored, and for the first time since she had met him, she was the one leading the way into the unknown. Late in the afternoon, as the sun began to sink and Grace's own strength was failing, she smelled it, a strange scent on the air, a mix of wood smoke, sulfur, and something else, something sharp and herbal that reminded her of medicine. "The smoke," Red Cloud murmured, his voice faint. "We are close." She followed the scent to a wall of rock that seemed to be a dead end, but as she ran her hands along the cold stone, she felt a warmth emanating from a narrow crack, and with it, the strange medicinal smell was stronger. A thin gray plume of smoke or steam curled from the opening, dissolving into the crisp mountain air. It was a place that did not want to be found. She helped him through the opening into a space that was both a cave and a dwelling. It was a wide, high chamber, warmed by a natural steam vent in the floor that hissed softly. A small fire burned in a ring of stones, and the air was filled with the scent of drying herbs that hung in bundles from the rock walls. An old woman sat by the fire, her back to them. She was wrapped in a blanket of rabbit skins, and she did not turn as they entered. "You have been a long time coming, Red Cloud," she said, her voice like the rustle of dry leaves. "And you have brought a guest." "Winnemer," Red Cloud breathed, and the tension seemed to drain from him as he sagged against Grace. "I am hurt." The old woman finally turned. Grace could feel the intensity of her presence, a dry, ancient heat like the stones by the fire. She heard the soft pad of the woman's moccasins on the dusty floor as she approached. A hand, wrinkled and gnarled as an old root, touched Grace's cheek. The touch was surprisingly gentle, the fingertips tracing the line of her jaw. "A strong spirit in a broken cage," Winnemer said, her voice not unkind. "The world has not been good to you, child of no sight." Then she turned her attention to Red Cloud. "Bring him to the fire. The bullet is full of the white man's poison." For the next day and night, Winnemer and Grace worked to save him. The old woman was a force of nature. Her movements slow but certain, she had Grace grind herbs into a paste with a smooth stone, identifying them for her by their texture and scent. She brewed a bitter tea that smelled of bark and roots, and made Grace help her force it between Red Cloud's lips. She cleaned the wound with water heated by dropping hot stones into a hollowed-out gourd, and then packed it with a poultice of green moss and the herbal paste. Grace learned through her hands, her sense of smell, her ability to listen. She felt the right consistency for the paste, smelled the moment the tea was ready, heard the change in Red Cloud's breathing as the poultice drew out the heat of the infection. She was no longer a helper, but an apprentice. On the third day, Red Cloud was lucid, the fever gone. The pain in his shoulders subsided to a dull, clean ache. He sat propped against a pile of furs, watching Grace as she moved about the cave, helping Winnemer. He saw a change in her, a quiet confidence in her movements she had not possessed before. That evening, as the steam from the vent hissed its soft song, Winnemer spoke to them of the future. "The soldiers are still hunting," she said, looking at Red Cloud. "And the man Crane, his greed is a hungry ghost. It will not rest. You cannot stay in these mountains. The snows are coming." "We will go north," Red Cloud said. "To Oregon, across the border." Winnemer nodded slowly, her dark eyes fixed on the fire. "The passes will be watched. There is only one safe path, a hard path. It is the tunnel of souls." Grace felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air. "What is that?" "A lava tube," the old woman explained. "A long cave, carved by the river of fire when the world was young. It runs for miles under the mountains. Our people say the spirits of the dead travel that road to the next world. It is a dark, cold place, a place of echoes, but it will lead you to the other side, where the soldiers will not look." She rose and went to a small leather pouch that hung on the wall. From it, she took something and returned to the fire. She took Grace's hand and pressed a small, smooth object into her palm. It was a stone, oblong and flat, cool to the touch, with a single, deep groove worn into it. "What is this?" Grace asked, her fingers exploring its strange, comforting shape. "It is a listening stone," Winnemer said. "My grandfather took it from the heart of a fallen star. It does not give sight to the eyes. It gives focus to the heart, in the darkness of the spirit tunnel. Your ears will be filled with lies, the echoes of your own fear. Your skin will feel the cold of despair, but your heart will know the true way. This stone will help you listen to it." Grace closed her hand around the stone. It seemed to pulse with a faint, latent warmth, as if it held a memory of the star from which it had come. It felt like a key, a compass, a promise. Later that night, as Red Cloud slept a true, healing sleep, Grace sat by the fire with Winnemer. The old woman seemed more fragile now, the energy she had expended in healing Red Cloud having taken its toll. "He is a good man," Winnemer said, her voice a near whisper. "His heart was broken into many sharp pieces. I think you are making him whole again." "He saved me," Grace said. "He is teaching me how to see." Winnemer smiled, a faint crinkling of the 1,000 lines around her eyes. "And you are teaching him the same lesson. There are many kinds of blindness." The old woman grew tired, her breathing becoming soft and shallow. She leaned her head back against the furs she was sitting on and closed her eyes. Grace thought she had fallen asleep and continued to sit in the quiet, holding the listening stone, feeling its solid reality in her hand. The fire burned down to glowing embers, and the only sounds were the hissing of the steam and the soft rhythm of two people breathing. Sometime in the deep, silent hours before dawn, one of those rhythms ceased. Grace did not notice it at first, but a change in the quality of the silence, a new and profound stillness in the air, made her turn her head. She reached out a hand and touched Winnemer's arm. It was cool. The life, the ancient, dry heat that had been in her, was gone. She had passed on as peacefully as a candle flame being extinguished by a gentle breath. She had given them her knowledge. She had given them a path. She had given Grace a key to a sight deeper than vision. And then, her work done. The old woman of the smoke had simply let go, leaving them alone once more, in a world that was still dangerous, but no longer entirely without light. They laid Winnemer to rest in the way she had lived, with a quiet simplicity that was its own form of reverence. Red Cloud, his movements still stiff and pained, gathered stones to cover her shallow grave, placing them one by one in a pattern of protection and farewell. Grace sat nearby, the listening stone clutched in her hand, its smooth surface a tangible link to the woman who had given it to her. She hummed the lullaby her mother had taught her, the simple melody a soft counterpoint to the sighing of the wind. There were no grand words, only a shared, silent grief for the passing of a light from the world. When it was done, they stood for a moment in the thin mountain air. The silence she left behind was a presence, a vast and lonely space. "We must go," Red Cloud said, his voice low, "before the first snow. The tunnel is half a day's journey from here, at the mouth of a narrow canyon." His shoulder had healed, but it was a fragile, scarred thing. He could not draw a bow, and the arm had lost much of its strength. He moved with a new, deliberate care, a warrior forced to acknowledge his own mortal limits. The knowledge of this vulnerability was a constant, unspoken tension between them. Grace was his strength now in ways he had never anticipated, and he was her only shield in a world that had always been hostile. They gathered what little they could carry, a small parcel of dried meat, a full canteen, and the memory of Winnemer's wisdom. They set out as the morning sun warmed the rocks, leaving the hidden cave of steam and herbs behind. Red Cloud led the way, his instincts guiding them through the rugged country, but now Grace was an active partner in their journey. She would stop, her head tilted, and point. "The sound of the water is louder that way," she would say. "The canyon must be close." He would listen and realize she was right. Her world of sound was more detailed than his, her senses a fine net that caught nuances he missed. They moved as one, a single being with two bodies, each compensating for the other's blindness. They found the canyon in the late afternoon. It was a deep, angry gash in the earth, its walls sheer and black, made of the same volcanic rock as the lava beds. The wind howled through it, a low, mournful sound that seemed to be the mountain's own voice. At the far end, barely visible, was a dark opening, a perfect circle of blackness against the black rock, the entrance to the Tunnel of Souls. They were halfway down the treacherous path that led to the canyon floor, when Red Cloud froze. He put a hand on Grace's arm, his fingers pressing with sudden, sharp urgency. "What is it?" she whispered. He did not answer. He was looking back the way they had come. Grace listened, stretching her senses. The wind was loud, but beneath it, she could hear a different sound, a rhythmic, metallic clinking that was growing steadily closer. Horses and men. "Crane," Red Cloud said, the name a curse on the wind. Fear, cold and familiar, washed over Grace. How did he find us? "He has trackers, men who can read a broken branch and a turned stone. They are good, but I am better." He pulled her along, his pace quickening. "We must reach the tunnel." They scrambled down the last of the path, their feet slipping on the loose scree. The canyon floor was a narrow strip of gray sand and shattered rock. The dark mouth of the lava tube was still 100 yards away. The sounds of pursuit were closer now, the shouts of men echoing off the high canyon walls. They would not make it. Red Cloud stopped, turning to face the entrance of the canyon. He pushed Grace gently towards the cave. "Go," he said, his voice flat and hard. "Get inside. Do not come out." "No," she said, her hand clutching his good arm. "I will not leave you." "You will be safe in there. They will not follow you into the dark." He looked at her, and though she could not see his eyes, she felt the full weight of his gaze. It was a look of farewell. "Grace, go, now." "They will kill you," she pleaded, her voice breaking. "They will try," he said. He took a length of rawhide cord from his belt and pressed it into her hand. "Stay at the mouth of the tunnel. Hold this. If you feel one tug, the danger is to my left. 2 tugs, to my right. If it shakes without stopping, they are coming straight for me. Can you do this?" She nodded, her throat too tight for words. This was not a goodbye. It was a command. He was making her his partner, his eyes in the darkness. He gave her a last, desperate push.
Go!
She stumbled away, her feet finding their way over the uneven ground to the absolute blackness of the cave. She turned at the entrance, the rawhide cord a lifeline in her trembling hands. The other end was tied around Red Cloud's wrist. She watched the battle through the ears of a blind girl. It was a storm of noise, a symphony of violence. She heard the thunder of horses entering the canyon, the harsh, triumphant shouts of the trackers, and Crane's voice, high and thin with vindictive rage. "There he is! Kill the savage! The girl is mine!" Then came the first gunshot, deafening in the enclosed space. It was followed by the warrior's cry of the Modoc, a sound that was not human, but something older and more terrible, the cry of a cornered panther. The fight began. Grace's world shrank to the vibrations in the rawhide cord. A single, sharp tug. She heard a man scream in pain from the left, a sound cut short with a sickening, wet crunch. Red Cloud was using the rocks for cover, moving with a speed that defied his injury. Two sharp tugs. She heard the frantic whinny of a horse from the right, then a heavy thud as a man fell from the saddle. The cord in her hand was a living thing, transmitting the chaos of the battle directly into her nerves. She could hear the grunt of effort from Red Cloud, the panting of his breath, the clang of his hatchet against a rifle barrel. She was part of the fight. She was his anchor. Her fear was a cold, hard knot in her stomach, but her hands were steady. She listened, her entire being focused on the sounds from the canyon. She heard a man trying to circle around a large boulder. One tug. She felt the cord go slack for a moment. Then, a sharp vibration as Red Cloud met the threat. The fight was a blur of brutal, close-quarters combat. Red Cloud was a whirlwind of desperate, focused violence. His wounded shoulder was a searing fire, but he ignored it. He fought with the cold fury he had held in check for so long, the fury of a man who had seen his world burn to ashes. He was not just fighting for Grace. He was fighting for his mother, for his people, for every spirit that had been silenced by the greed and hatred of men like Crane. One by one, the hired men fell. They were woodsmen and trackers, not warriors. They were no match for a man defending the last thing in the world that mattered to him. Soon, there was only one left. The cord in Grace's hand shook violently. A continuous, frantic vibration. Straight ahead. "Come on, you devil," Crane screamed, his voice cracking with a mixture of fear and rage. He had a long skinning knife in his hand, its blade gleaming in the fading light. "You took what was mine." Red Cloud stood in the center of the narrow canyon, his chest heaving. He was bleeding from a shallow cut on his cheek. His hatchet was in his hand. "She was never yours," he said, his voice low and dangerous. Crane lunged. A clumsy, desperate rush. Red Cloud sidestepped easily, the hatchet a blur, but the pain in his shoulder chose that moment to betray him, a white-hot spike of agony that made his arm falter. The move was a fraction of a second too slow. Crane's knife, more by luck than skill, found its mark. The blade sank deep into Red Cloud's side, just below the ribs. A gasp of pure agony was torn from Red Cloud's lips, but even as the knife went in, his own weapon completed its arc. The hatchet struck Crane with all the force of his dying strength. It was over in an instant. Grace felt the cord go completely limp. The chaotic symphony of the fight was replaced by a sudden, terrifying silence. The only sound was the lonely cry of the wind. "Red Cloud," she called out, her voice small and lost in the vast emptiness. There was no answer. She dropped the cord and stumbled out of the cave, her hands outstretched, searching the air. The smell of gunpowder and blood was thick and sickening. She moved towards the center of the canyon, her feet slipping in something wet and sandy. Her hands found him. He was on his knees, slumped forward. She felt the hilt of the knife still protruding from his side. She felt the hot, sticky wetness that was spreading across the front of his buckskin shirt, soaking the gray sand of the canyon floor. He collapsed the rest of the way, a dead weight against her. She caught him, sinking to the ground with him, pulling his head into her lap. "Red Cloud," she whispered, her hands frantically searching for a way to stop the bleeding, a way to fix what was so terribly broken. His blood was warm on her fingers, her dress, the sand, it was everywhere. He coughed, a terrible, wet sound. He tried to speak. His hand, the hand that had trembled with such powerful emotion, came up and found her cheek. His touch was weak, his fingers cold.
Grace,
He breathed, his voice a faint whisper of air. She bent her head low, pressing her face against his. The tears she had held back for so long finally breaking free. She held him tightly, as if she could pour her own life, her own strength, into his body. The canyon walls echoed with the sound of her solitary, desperate prayer, a plea whispered into the coming darkness, under a sky that had turned the color of blood and ashes. The world was a vortex of pain and terror, and Grace was at its still center, holding the man who was her entire universe. The silence of the canyon was more terrible than the noise of the battle had been. It was a dead, final silence, broken only by the ragged, shallow sound of red clouds breathing and the lonely cry of the wind. Despair was a luxury she could not afford. The cold was seeping into him, the life draining out with every drop of blood that soaked the sand. She had to move. She had to do something. The warrior in him was fading, and the healer she had discovered within herself had to rise. Her first thought was the knife, her fingers, slick with his blood, brushed against the smooth, wooden hilt. A part of her, a primitive, panicked part, wanted to pull it out, to remove the thing that was killing him. But Winnemer's quiet wisdom echoed in her mind. The old woman had spoken of a hunter gored by a boar, and how the tusk itself had plugged the wound, keeping the life inside. To remove it was to invite the final, fatal flood. She had to leave it. Her next thought was of shelter, the tunnel of souls. It was their only hope, a passage to another world, in more ways than one. But he was a dead weight, a mountain she could not possibly move. She tried to lift him, her arms straining, a desperate sob of frustration escaping her lips. It was impossible. Then she remembered how he had taught her to use her body, to find leverage, to work with the earth and not against it. She would not lift him. She would drag him. She tore a long, wide strip from her dress, the sturdy cotton making a sound like a gunshot in the quiet canyon. She looped it under his arms and across her own shoulders, creating a crude harness. She leaned forward, putting all of her weight, all of her will, into the effort. The ground resisted. For a heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. Then, with a groan that seemed to come from the very center of the earth, he began to move. She dragged him across the sand, inch by agonizing inch, a slow, desperate pilgrimage towards the dark mouth of the cave. The sand grated under his body. A terrible, grinding sound. Her muscles screamed, her lungs burned, but she did not stop. She was fueled by a love so fierce it had become a kind of madness. Entering the lava tube was like being swallowed whole. The world of light and wind vanished, replaced by an absolute, suffocating darkness and a profound, chilling silence. The air was cold and damp, smelling of stone and ancient water. Red Cloud's breathing was the only landmark in the endless night, a faint, rasping counterpoint to the frantic pounding of her own heart. The floor of the tunnel was uneven, a treacherous landscape of unseen pits and sharp ridges. She had only her bare feet and the listening stone to guide her. She clutched the stone in one hand, its smooth, grooved surface a tangible connection to Winnemer's faith in her. She focused, trying to listen as she had been taught, not with her ears, but with her whole body. She felt the subtle slope of the floor, the way the air current shifted around a pillar of rock, the faint vibrations in the stone that told her where the path was solid. The journey was a nightmare. She pulled him, her body a single, screaming knot of pain. She fell, scraping her knees and hands on the sharp rock, but she always got up, her grip on the harness never slackening. In the darkness, the echoes of her fear were her greatest enemy. Every drip of water sounded like a footstep behind her. The whisper of the draft in the tunnel sounded like the voices of the dead. But she held on to the stone, its solid reality a shield against the ghosts of her mind. She thought of his face, the feel of it under her hands, strong and sad, and she kept going. She did not know how long she was in the tunnel. It could have been hours or days. Time had no meaning in that eternal darkness. She moved in a trance of pain and determination, her world reduced to the strain in her shoulders and the faint, precious sound of his breath. Then a change. A faint, almost imperceptible shift in the air ahead. It was a lightening of the oppressive blackness, a whisper of a different world. A current of cool, fresh air touched her cheek, carrying the scent of damp earth and river water. Hope, fierce and desperate, surged through her. She emerged from the tunnel into a world of pearly gray light. It was the hour before dawn, a time of profound and sacred stillness. They were in a small, hidden cove, surrounded by high rock walls. A river flowed past, its surface a smooth, dark mirror reflecting the lightening sky. The water made a soft, shushing sound, a lullaby after the harsh silence of the tunnel. Red Cloud was still breathing, but his pulse, when she pressed her fingers to his neck, was a faint, thready flutter. She had to get him across the river. She had to get him to Oregon, to safety. She found a collection of driftwood piled up against the bank by the current. Working with frantic haste, her fingers numb with cold and exhaustion, she began to build a raft. She chose the thickest, most buoyant logs, laying them side by side. She used the rawhide cord from the battle and the last of her tattered dress to lash them together. It was a clumsy, desperate creation, but she hoped it would hold. Getting him onto the raft was the hardest thing she had ever done. He was so heavy, his body limp and unresponsive. She pulled and pushed, using a piece of driftwood as a lever, her breath coming in ragged sobs. Finally, with one last, monumental effort, she slid him from the bank and onto the logs. She pushed the raft out into the current, using a long branch as a pole. The water was shockingly cold as it swirled around her ankles. The small raft dipped precariously, but held. The river caught them, a gentle but insistent force, pulling them away from the shore, away from the blood and ashes of the canyon, away from the darkness of the tunnel. As they drifted into the center of the river, the first rays of the rising sun broke over the canyon wall, striking the water. The dark mirrored surface was transformed into a dazzling, shimmering path of liquid gold, the river of light. Grace looked down at Red Cloud. A small, crimson thread was unfurling from the bandage on his side, a slow, steady seep of his life into the river. But in the golden light of the dawn, the blood did not look like an omen of death. It caught the nascent light, turning the water the color of ruby, a vibrant, beautiful, and strangely hopeful sight. It was as if the river was washing him clean, carrying away the pain and the violence, baptizing him into this new day. It was a second birth, a desperate, fragile beginning. She was so lost in the moment, in the strange, terrible beauty of it all, that she did not hear the horse until it was right at the river's edge. Her head snapped up, her body going rigid with terror. A lone rider sat on a tall bay horse, a silhouette against the rising sun. A soldier. Her heart sank. After everything, after all she had done, they were caught. It was over. The rider dismounted and walked to the water's edge. As he drew closer, she recognized the sound of his boots, the quiet authority in his posture. "Lieutenant Reed," she breathed, her voice a dry whisper. He stood there for a long moment, taking in the scene. He saw the crude raft, the unconscious warrior, and the small, fierce woman standing guard over him, a makeshift pole in her hands. He saw the blood in the water, and the exhaustion that was so deep it was a physical part of her. He saw not a captive, but a rescuer. "I told my men I was scouting ahead," he said, his voice quiet, carrying easily over the soft murmur of the river. "I seem to have gotten myself lost. He looked at Red Cloud, his face grim.
Is he? He is alive, Grace said, her voice fierce. He needs a doctor. He is not a monster. He is the man who saved my life.
Lieutenant Reed looked from her to the wounded man, and something in his soldier's face softened. He saw the truth, a truth that had little to do with laws and orders, and everything to do with the stubborn, inexplicable bonds of the human heart. He had been given a choice on that mountain ledge, and he had chosen a kind of justice. Now, the river was asking him to choose again.
He unslung a canvas pack from his saddle. There is a trading post about 5 miles downriver, on this side. It is run by a French trapper and his wife. She knows something of healing. Tell them you found him like this. A hunting accident.
He walked to the edge of the water and placed the pack on the bank.
There is food in here,
and bandages, and a bottle of carbolic to clean the wound.
It is all I can do.
He looked at her, his eyes full of a strange, sad respect. This is the Oregon side of the river. You are across the border now. I have no jurisdiction here. My report will say that my patrol lost your trail in the mountains. It will say that the Modoc warrior is presumed dead, and that you, Miss Miller, likely perished in the wilderness. He turned without another word and walked back to his horse. He mounted, and for a moment, he sat looking at the small raft, a fragile vessel of hope floating on a river of light. Then, he turned his horse and rode away, not looking back, a man who had chosen to become lost so that 2 others could be found. The river was a gentle, relentless guide. Grace kept the makeshift raft in the main current, using the pole Lieutenant Reed's presence had miraculously provided, fending off snags and sandbars. The sun climbed higher, warming her chilled bones but doing little to ease the cold dread that had settled deep inside her. Red Cloud lay terrifyingly still, his life a fragile flicker she could only measure by the faint rise and fall of his chest. She used the carbolic from the soldier's pack, the sharp, clean scent, a stark contrast to the smell of blood. She cleaned the wound as best she could, her touch gentle, her heart a stone of prayer. The trading post appeared around a bend in the river, a small, hopeful collection of log buildings that smelled of wood smoke, curing hides, and coffee. A few rough-looking men stopped their work to stare as she pulled the strange, blood-stained raft to the muddy bank. A large man with a thick, graying beard and a pipe clenched in his teeth came down to meet her. His eyes narrowed with suspicion.
Hunting accident, Grace said before he could speak, the words she had rehearsed 100 times in her mind. He fell on his own knife. Please, he needs help.
The big man, Jacques, grunted, his gaze taking in the Indian warrior and the blind, desperate girl. It was a story full of holes, but he had seen enough of the world to know that sometimes the most unlikely stories were the truest. He looked at Grace, at the raw determination etched on her young face, and his suspicion gave way to a grudging respect. He yelled something in French, and a woman emerged from the largest cabin, wiping her hands on an apron. Her name was Elodie, and her hands were as gentle as her husband's were rough. She was a small, bird-like woman with kind eyes and a practical, no-nonsense air. She took one look at Red Cloud's ashen face and the ugly wound in his side and immediately took charge. With Jacques' help, they carried him into their own cabin and laid him on a rope bed in the corner. The days that followed were a waking nightmare of fear and exhaustion. Elodie was a skilled healer, her knowledge a blend of old country remedies and practical frontier medicine. She removed the knife with a surgeon's precision and fought the infection with poultices of willow bark and yarrow. Grace was her constant shadow, her hands never still. She ground herbs, boiled water, tore bandages, and sat for hours by Red Cloud's side, talking to him, singing her mother's lullaby, willing him to stay. She learned the geography of the small cabin through touch and sound, the feel of the rough-hewn table, the scent of the drying herbs that hung from the rafters, the steady, rhythmic click of Elodie's knitting needles in the quiet evenings. Red Cloud hovered in the gray world between life and death. The wound was deep, and his body, already weakened, struggled to mend, but he was a warrior, and his will to live was a stubborn, deep-rooted thing. Slowly, painstakingly, he began to heal. The fever receded, and one morning, Grace reached out to touch his forehead and found it cool. Later that day, his eyes opened, and they were clear. He looked at her, his gaze full of a profound, unspoken gratitude that was more eloquent than any words. Their new life began in that small, warm cabin. As Red Cloud regained his strength, a quiet routine settled over them. He was not the man he had been. The wound had stolen a measure of his physical power, leaving him with a permanent ache and a reminder of his own mortality. He could no longer move with the silent, predatory grace of a hunter on the run. He was quieter, more thoughtful. His warrior's energy turned inward. When he was strong enough, he began to hunt for Jacques and Elodie, bringing in deer and rabbit. He was not just repaying a debt. He was weaving himself into the fabric of this small, isolated community. The other trappers and settlers at the post were wary at first, their gazes lingering on the Modoc warrior who lived with the blind white woman. But his quiet dignity and the consistent supply of fresh meat he provided slowly eroded their suspicion, replacing it with a grudging acceptance. Grace, too, found a new purpose. She could not be idle. Her hands, which had known only the hard labor of the logging camp, longed for a task. It was Elodie who gave her one. She sat Grace down at a large, wooden loom that took up one wall of the main trading room.
"The wool is from my own sheep,"
Elodie said, guiding Grace's hands over the taut strings of the warp.
"You feel the pattern with your fingers, the colors."
"I will describe them to you. This red is the color of a sunset. This blue is the river in the morning. This yellow is the aspen leaves in the fall." Grace had found her art. Weaving was a language her hands understood perfectly. Her blindness, for so long a curse, became a gift. She could feel the texture of the yarn, the tension of the weave, the subtle imperfections that gave a piece its character. In a way no sighted person could, she created patterns from the world she knew. The jagged lines of the lava beds, the soft curve of a river bend, the intricate spiral of a spider's web. Her rugs were beautiful, thick and warm, and they held the stories of her journey in their threads. Trappers passing through would buy them, marveling at the work of the blind weaver. For the first time in her life, she was not a burden or a curiosity. She was an artist, a creator, a woman of value. They lived in a small cabin that Red Cloud built with Jacques' help at the edge of the settlement. It was a simple, sturdy structure that smelled of fresh-cut pine and wood smoke. It was the first home she had ever known. Their life was quiet, a gentle rhythm of shared work and peaceful companionship. They spoke little, but their silence was a comfortable, living thing, full of unspoken understanding. Their full acceptance into the community came with the spring flood. A week of warm rain on the heavy winter snowpack turned the river into a raging, muddy monster. It chewed at the banks, pulling trees into its current and threatening the low-lying cabins of the settlement. The community worked together, frantically building makeshift levees of sand and rock. In the midst of the chaos, a cry of terror cut through the roar of the water. A small boy, the son of a settler, had been playing too close to the bank and had been swept away. He was clinging to a half-submerged log, his small voice a thin thread of panic against the river's fury. The men stood helpless on the bank. To enter that current was suicide, but Red Cloud did not hesitate. He grabbed a long coil of rope, tied one end around his waist, and gave the other to Jacques. He moved with a flash of his old warrior's speed, plunging into the icy, churning water. He was not as strong as he had been, but he was a powerful swimmer, and he understood the river. He used the current, angling his body, letting it carry him towards the terrified child. Grace stood on the bank with the others, her face a pale mask of fear. She could not see, but she could hear. She could hear the roar of the water, the shouts of the men, and above it all, the high, desperate cries of the boy. And she could hear something else, a pattern in the chaos. "He is being pulled toward the old cottonwood," she cried out, her voice sharp with authority. "The current is faster there. Tell him." Jacques relayed her warning, and the men on the bank watched in amazement as Red Cloud, guided by a blind woman's ears, changed his course, intercepting the log just before it was smashed against the gnarled roots of the ancient tree. He grabbed the boy, holding him tight, and the men on the shore hauled them in, pulling them from the deadly embrace of the river. That night, the community celebrated. They were safe. The boy was safe, and they had a new hero. They brought food and drink to the small cabin, their faces full of a gratitude and respect that went beyond mere tolerance. They were no longer the strange outsiders. They were neighbors. They were friends. Later, after everyone had gone, Grace and Red Cloud sat by their own small fire. The cabin was filled with the comfortable silence they both cherished. He was tending to his shoulder, which ached from the strain of the rescue. She reached out and placed her hand on his arm.
"I was so afraid today,"
she said, her voice a soft murmur. He covered her hand with his own. "I was not. I heard your voice. You were my eyes." She leaned her head against his good shoulder, the rough wool of his shirt familiar and comforting. "I do not need eyes to see," she whispered, the words coming from the deepest part of her heart. "I just need you not to leave me." She felt his chest rise and fall with a long, slow breath. He was silent for a long time, and in the quiet, she could feel the steady, reassuring beat of his heart. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide.
"When I first saw you,"
he said softly, "my hand trembled. It was the hand of a warrior who had forgotten what it was to protect, and only knew how to hate. Now," he brought her hand to his lips, his touch gentle, reverent. "This warrior's hand will always tremble, but not from fear, and not from anger." He turned her hand over and pressed a soft kiss into her palm. "It will tremble because of love." The seasons turned. The harsh, biting winter gave way to the muddy, hopeful thaw of spring, which in turn ripened into the deep, buzzing green of a long, warm summer. The small trading post on the Oregon side of the river was no longer just a refuge. It was home. The rhythm of their lives was as steady and peaceful as the flow of the river in the dry season. He hunted, she wove, and in the quiet evenings, they would sit by their fire, her head resting on his shoulder, his hand holding hers, their shared silence a language richer than any spoken word. The idea of a wedding was not theirs. It came from Elodie, who believed that a love so hard won deserved to be celebrated, to be witnessed and blessed by the community that had become their family. Grace was hesitant at first. The rituals of the world she had left behind meant little to her, but Red Cloud, to her surprise, agreed. "Our lives began again here," he said, his voice a low rumble against her ear. "It is right that we mark the new beginning, not for them, for us." And so, on a day in late summer when the air was warm and smelled of pine and dust and the promise of autumn, they were married. There was no church, no preacher in a black coat. Their cathedral was a sun-dappled clearing in the heart of the old-growth forest, the tall pines their silent, ancient witnesses. Everyone from the settlement was there. Jacques, his booming laugh echoing through the trees, stood as the closest thing they had to an official. Elodie, her eyes shining, had woven a garland of wildflowers for Grace's hair. The boy Red Cloud had saved from the flood stood beside his parents, his eyes wide with a hero's worship. The rough trappers and settlers, men and women who had once looked at them with suspicion, now stood with their hats in their hands, their faces open and friendly. They were a strange, patchwork family, forged by the shared hardship and simple kindness of life on the frontier. Red Cloud did not wear the clothes of the white man. He wore soft, beaded buckskins, a single hawk feather tied in his dark hair. He was not the hunted, haunted warrior from the lava beds, but he was still a Modoc, and he stood with a quiet, unshakable dignity that was a testament to all he had survived. At his side, an old trapper who had known the Modoc people before the wars beat a slow, steady rhythm on a small hand drum, a sound like the heartbeat of the earth itself. Grace wore a simple dress of pale blue cotton that Elodie had helped her sew. The wild flowers in her hair brushed against her cheek, their soft, fragrant petals a gentle caress. She stood beside Red Cloud, her hand in his, and listened to the sounds of their life, the steady beat of the drum, the soft whisper of the wind in the high branches, the murmur of their friends. All of it a beautiful, complex song. Then she began to sing. It was not her mother's lullaby, a song of comfort in a time of sorrow. This was a new song, one that had come to her in the quiet hours at her loom, a melody of her own making. It had no words, only a rising, falling cadence that spoke of a long, dark journey and a safe harbor found at last. Her clear, pure voice soared through the trees, weaving itself around the steady beat of the drum. It was the sound of two worlds, two souls, two survivors, becoming one. Far from the clearing, hidden in a thick stand of aspen at the edge of the forest, another man watched. Lieutenant Reed sat on his horse, his blue uniform a stark, out-of-place slash of color against the greens and browns of the wilderness. He had been promoted to captain, but the new stripes on his sleeve felt hollow, a reward for a duty he had come to question. He had told his superiors he was on a long-range patrol, a lie that had become easier with practice. He had needed to see, he had needed to know that his choice on that long-ago day, his quiet act of rebellion, had meant something. He had expected to find them merely surviving. He had not expected to find them thriving, surrounded by a community, their lives woven together in a tapestry of such profound and simple beauty. He watched as Jacques said a few simple words. As Grace and Red Cloud turned to face each other, he saw the way the warrior looked at the blind girl, a look of such fierce, tender devotion that it made something ache in his own chest. He saw the radiant, trusting smile she gave him in return. This, he thought, was a kind of justice the law books would never understand. It was not about punishment or retribution. It was about healing. It was about two broken people finding a way to make each other whole again, under a sky that was big enough for all of them. A slow smile spread across his face, a smile of quiet, profound satisfaction. He had followed his orders many times in his life, but this one act of defiance was the only thing he had ever done that felt truly, unequivocally right. He turned his horse, and without making a sound, rode away, a keeper of a secret, a guardian of a peace he had helped to create. In the clearing, the ceremony was over. Red Cloud turned to Grace. He took both of her hands in his. "My hands were made for fighting," he said, his voice for her alone. They knew the feel of the hatchet and the bow. They knew anger, and they knew loss. Now, they know only the feel of your hands, the shape of your face, the threads of the life we are weaving together. They are no longer a warrior's hands. They are your hands. Grace brought his hands to her face, pressing his calloused palms against her cheeks. My world was a small, dark room. She whispered. I knew its walls, its corners, its fears. You came and you threw open the door. You did not give me sight. My love, you gave me the world. You taught me how to hear the heart of the mountain and how to feel the warmth of the sun. You are my sight, and it is more beautiful than anything eyes could ever see. He leaned down and kissed her, a gentle, reverent kiss that sealed their past and promised a future. The little community erupted in cheers, their happy voices rising to the sky. He took her hand, and they stood together, facing the light. The afternoon sun was warm and bright, pouring down through the canopy of the pines, dappling the forest floor with gold. Grace lifted her face to the warmth. Her eyelids closed. The light was a palpable presence, a radiant pressure against her skin. It was more intense than she had ever felt it, a brilliant, overwhelming flood. As she stood there, her hand held firmly in his. The warmth and the light and the love all merged into a single, transcendent sensation. For a breathtaking instant, the darkness behind her eyes was filled with a blinding, beautiful whiteness. It was not an image, not a picture, but a feeling so powerful it became a form of vision. In that moment, she saw everything. She saw the strength in his hand, the kindness of their friends, the peace of their home, and the long, sunlit path of the life that stretched out before them. She saw it all, not with her eyes, but with her heart, and for the first time, her world was not dark at all. It was filled with light. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And do not forget to subscribe to our channel Wild West Tales. Like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.